One of my fondest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating in the neighborhood where I grew up. I didn't have much of a costume since I decided at the last minute to join my older brother. I was pretty scared at the thought of all those little monsters roaming around, but that fear quickly faded when I thought about the mountain of Halloween candy waiting for us. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to turn my face into a skeleton, and I ended up wearing a ripped trash bag, looking like a quirky garbage gal. I probably looked a bit silly next to the other kids dressed as Batman and Superman, but that didn't bother me at all. I was just focused on collecting my share of candy, and there was plenty to go around. My brother, who was 13 at the time, took me along with him and his middle school friends. I was amazed at how much fun it was to actually be out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes. People were giving us tons of candy, and not just the usual treat. At one house, I think it was the town dentist, they teased us with toothbrushes, only to reveal they were joking and handed us real candy instead. Another place gave us little Charlie Brown comic books. At one point, a man asked me to open my candy bag, and then I dropped something small and white into it before heading off. I had no idea that Halloween was like Christmas, just a bit spookier. By the time my brother and I got back home, I think it had quickly become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember is our mom asking us to dump our candy bags out at either end of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take about 3/4 of what we collected and stash it away so we wouldn't eat ourselves into a sugar overload. But shortly after I emptied my bag onto the table, Mom came over to sort through the treats. She took one look at my candy and immediately started to panic. She kept pointing at one specific item, asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave it to you?" When I told her I didn't know, she insisted I think harder and remember who had put it in my bag. I remember feeling upset and starting to cry, and I cried even more when Mom picked up the phone and asked the operator to connect her to the police, declaring it an emergency. 30 years earlier, when my mom was around my age, all the kids in our hometown went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl came home not just with a bag of candy but also with a small white doll made of cloth rags. Her mom thought nothing of it and let her keep the doll. However, just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to a park with a sand pit and a jungle gym. While the kids played with others, she chatted with another mom. Meanwhile, a man had been leaning against the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The mom assumed he was just a father or grandfather watching the kids play. But then, as she was watching, she noticed the man getting her daughter's attention and calling her over. Once again, everything seemed completely innocent at first. However, the mother noticed a man dressed in a long coat, hat, and scarf, his face partially hidden. He reached out and asked for her daughter's hand. The mother watched in alarm as her little girl complied. When the man leaned in, seemingly to smell her daughter's hand, the mother quickly moved to intervene. She instructed her child to step away from the strange man and demanded to know what he was doing talking to kids like that. The man remained silent, simply turning and walking away before she could confront him. Naturally, the mother was anxious to find out what had transpired, but when she asked her daughter, the response only deepened her concerns. The little girl claimed she didn't understand what the man had said, yet when her mother inquired how she knew to approach him and offer her hand, the girl looked puzzled and said she didn't know. She also mentioned that instead of sniffing her hand, the man had said something to it, which she couldn't comprehend. When the mother asked if she recognized the man from anywhere, the girl replied that he was the same person who had given her a little white doll while she was out trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mother was filled with dread upon realizing the connection between the doll and that unsettling man, prompting her to rush to alert others. The police issued an APB for the man, and nearly every officer in town was on the lookout for him. However, after a while without any sightings, they concluded he was just a drifter who had left town at the first sign of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized him, which in a small town like theirs usually indicated he wasn't a local. After 48 hours passed with no reports from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone assumed he had moved on. It only took a few days for them to realize how mistaken they were. One morning, a young mother went to wake her daughter for school, only to discover she was missing from her bed. After searching the house and finding no sign of her, she alerted her husband, who promptly called the police. Within 24 hours, Nearly every officer in the state was searching for the missing girl. While a large team of cops and volunteers scoured the fields and woods around town, a group of state detectives searched the girl's bedroom for clues. To their surprise, they found a small white doll tucked inside her pillowcase, one that appeared to be made from old rags. The police then held a press conference, asking if any other children had similar dolls. Only one set of parents came forward, stating their daughter had also returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll. A doll in her candy bag belonged to a little girl who happened to be my mom's best friend. You might have thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, right? I can't blame you. I thought the same when I first heard the story from her. However, the truth is that the whole experience left her quite shaken. Her friend and her family nearly had a nervous breakdown from the fear, and they eventually moved away because their daughter just couldn't feel safe anymore. My mom mentioned that everyone at school was convinced the man would return in the dead of night to take her away, just like he had done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. There were no remains or any credible sightings of her, despite numerous public appeals. It was as if that little girl had simply disappeared without a trace. Which only fueled the local kids' theory that a child snatcher was some sort of boogeyman who preyed on children with little white dolls on Halloween, devouring them in the nights that followed. Of course, that wasn't the reality, but adults couldn't share the whole truth with their kids. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she would return safely one day, though deep down, no one truly believed that. In fact, a quick death would have been one of the more merciful outcomes. Considering the situation of a grown man taking a young girl from her bed at night, it seems improbable that he quietly entered and grabbed her while she screamed. The dolls were likely meant to gain the child's trust, ensuring that when the moment arrived, she would leave without a fuss. Unfortunately, she did vanish without a trace, leading to her being declared legally dead around the time I finished college. The town moved on, but the memory lingered, especially for those closely connected to the incident. This is why my mom panicked when she dumped my bag of candy on the table and discovered a small white doll made from old rags nestled among the sweets. Naturally, she hurried to call 911. Once the police took possession of the doll, the entire town went into a frenzy, searching for whoever might have put it in my bag. 4 days, no child was allowed to go out alone. When the chaos subsided, the police suggested it was likely a copycat trying to instill fear, probably just a teenager who had heard the tale of the little white dolls and the girl who disappeared shortly after they were given out. They didn't believe anyone would seriously attempt to replicate the abduction. I wasn't the only one affected, but with the heavy police presence on the streets by November 1st, it seemed that alone was enough to keep things in check. I didn't get the full story until many years later. While my dad dismissed it as just kids being silly, it had a significant impact on my mom, likely because it resurfaced painful memories from her own childhood. I tend to think it was just a prank, with someone trying to be funny, since no one ever attempted to take any of the kids who received the dolls, not even years later. Still, I sometimes wonder how much of a prank it truly was. If the whole town had taken the dolls seriously, or if the guy hadn't chosen my candy bag to drop one into, would things have unfolded differently? Would another child have gone missing in the night, taken by the man who created those little white dolls? My name is Chris, and I'm from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I've been listening since last Halloween, but I think I missed the chance to share this story with you. It's about a childhood friend named Kevin and how we eventually drifted apart. Since it all began on Halloween night in 1993, I often reflect on it during this time of year. Parts of it are quite sad, but I find that scary stories often have that quality. The most terrifying events usually come with serious consequences, and they rarely lead to happy endings. Kevin and I lived on Dent Avenue, right across from the East Jerusalem Baptist Church, and we were good friends. During our time in elementary school and as we transitioned to middle school, we formed a tight-knit group of 4 friends: me, Kevin, Toby, who lived on Frederick Street, and Todd, whose family owned the seafood restaurant on East Hardy Street. We were practically inseparable, both at school and at home, especially on Saturday nights. One memorable Saturday was October 30th, 1993, when we were gearing up for some trick-or-treating the next night. As usual, we strolled between each other's houses until our whole crew was together. We typically wandered around the neighborhood until we found a spot to hang out, which was often the ballpark on Rebecca Avenue or some of the housing areas near a lawn. However, that night, with Halloween approaching, we had something special in mind. We started discussing the supposedly haunted places in Hattiesburg. There was Vernon D.'s old house, which had no connection to Jeffrey, the civil rights activist who was tragically murdered by the Klan in the 60s. His house was gone, leaving just an empty lot, but many claimed to have felt a strange presence there or even heard odd noises. Since Vernon's place was about 5 or 6 miles out of town, we decided against walking there on a Saturday night. We also considered the old train yard, rumored to be haunted, and the Hattiesburg Cemetery, which was a classic choice for some guaranteed scares. At some point, someone mentioned the abandoned house at the end of Elizabeth Avenue. The old 2-story home, reminiscent of plantation style with its tall wraparound columns and large shuttered windows, had been left to decay for as long as I could remember. I doubted it was ever part of a real plantation. It seemed more like the owner's attempt to create a grand appearance. It must have been quite impressive in its heyday, but by 1993, it had turned into a crumbling, termite-ridden shell of its former self, giving off a spooky vibe. Unlike the old Dmer place at the Hattiesburg Cemetery, we hadn't heard any ghost stories about this abandoned house, which might have been part of its allure. It looked like it should be haunted, so in our imaginations, it was. This belief allowed us to skip visiting the places we knew were actually haunted, almost like we were just being lazy. We strolled down Descent Avenue, crossed Gulfport Street, and continued along Elizabeth Avenue, chatting about what could have led to the house's abandonment. Todd speculated that the family patriarch had gone mad and killed his family, leaving the house too tainted to sell. Toby chimed in with the idea of a tragic accident that trapped restless spirits there, preventing any sale. We tossed around a few more theories, but the truth was, none of us really knew what had happened to that old place. The house on Elizabeth Avenue had been left to decay, and we figured the likelihood of encountering any ghostly happenings there was probably less than at the train yard or cemetery. We thought it was safe to hang out, but we couldn't have been more mistaken. As we strolled down the street, we were filled with youthful bravado, but that all changed when we reached the end of Elizabeth Avenue and saw the old house looming before us. Suddenly, our adventurous spirits faded. We chatted about the possibility of exploring it, searching for ghosts, hidden treasure, or some dark family secret, but when it came time to actually step inside, no one was eager to go in. I remember thinking that the old plantation house didn't seem nearly as eerie in the daylight, and even though I felt deep down that it was just filled with dust and cobwebs, I still couldn't muster the courage to enter. We stood there, whispering about how intimidating it looked, when Todd suddenly challenged me to go inside. I remember responding with something like, "No way, man. You must be out of your mind if you think I'm going in there alone." Then Todd dared Toby, who reacted similarly. But when Todd dared Kevin to go in, even for just a minute, Kevin asked, "What's in it for me?" Todd paused, clearly considering, and Kevin had a plan. He agreed to venture into a bedroom or the basement and bring back proof, but he wanted at least half of Todd's candy stash in return.